To ask. So here we go. We're going to start off with what we covered recently, which is image file formats. There's two basic image file formats in photography land, and the first one is called JPEG. JPEG stands for um, Joint Photographic Experts Groups. Those letters actually stand for something, and it's a file format that was originally developed in the 90s to save space on expensive hard drives. Photos were taking up too much room, so they needed to find a way to make them take up less room, and this is how they did it. So, some of the advantages of JPEG: the files are smaller than an uncompressed file. They can be used by just about any computer or screen that can access digital files, media files, and they're fast to work with. So lots of good stuff about JPEG. Um, so these are practical, very very practical things about JPEG that we like, and then there's some disadvantages. The number one disadvantage, well, actually, all of these disadvantages are kind of on the technical side. The first one is called lossy compression. That means every time a JPEG is saved, some data is lost. Now we're using relatively high quality these days, so you don't really see that, but just be aware it is there. If you open a JPEG, save a JPEG, open, save, open, save, open, save enough times, then you will see a loss in image quality. There's less options to edit the white balance. What that means is the white balance information in your photo is actually saved as part of the JPEG file. So that color data is actually transforming the pixels. They're changed, they're different. So you have a little bit less wiggle room when you get time to edit, especially if your white balance is way off of what is correct for a photo. The other thing that we have less options to edit is exposure, especially in the extremes of exposure. So very bright brights, very dark darks. We've got a little bit less room to fix problems there if we make exposure mistakes. So JPEG is great. There's lots of good stuff about it. It's basically the file format we also use for sharing. So even though I take photos in the other file format coming up here, RAW file, when I share it with anybody, it's a JPEG file. So it gets converted to a JPEG file. So whether I send it to a printer, whether I send it online or social media or email, it's a JPEG. So that's the wonderful thing about JPEG. It's so universal. Next file format up is called RAW. RAW. Those letters do not stand for anything. RAW does not stand for anything. It's basically a shortcut so that you understand what the file format does. If you look at the last word in this advantage, it's a digital negative. That's basically a definition of what a RAW file is. It is unaltered, pretty much unchanged from the light that came through the lens, controlled by shutter speed and aperture and ISO. And as it hit the lens and the sensor, that's exactly what's captured. So that means we have more options when we edit the white balance and exposure because there's more data there. It's not changed, it's not managed or anything. It's just what came into the sensor. So with white balance, what's different than JPEG is the white balance information, the color information for white balance is not actually added to the pixels. It's a data file basically that sits on top. It's an overlay, if you will. So it's very easy to change white balance. Even if you set your camera to a white balance that was totally incorrect for the scene you were in, it's very easy to fix with software. Exposure is because more data is saved with a JPEG file. With a RAW file. More data saved with RAW. We have more opportunity to correct exposures that when we're very close to the very bright brights or very dark darks. So we have more room to fix all that. So those are some technical good sides, and then some of the practical disadvantages to RAW files is their files are much larger. They're slower to work with. They take up more space on your computer, and they're not universally compatible. And so you need an interpreter for all kinds. Every RAW file needs an interpreter. Lightroom is one example of an interpreter. Photoshop's another one. There are other ones as well, but you can't just send a RAW file to anybody. And that's actually, you would never do that. Raw files are not for sharing. A raw file can't even really contain edits. So if you do send a raw file to someone that you've edited, they're going to get two files. They're going to get the raw file and a text file that has the edit information that needs to be combined in some specialized software like Lightroom or Photoshop. So raw files are great for capturing photos that have the most options for editing. They have the most options for editing because they have the most data, the most technical ability to deal with potential exposure issues. So that's the good side of RAW and downside of RAW. So in summary, JPEG is great for speed and compatibility and for sharing, and RAW is great for capturing the most information so you have the most opportunity to make edits and corrections if you need to. All right, moving on. What is our next topic? Our next topic is resolution. Resolution is something you don't have to worry about in our modern world very much because we have all of our devices are now high resolution. So our screens, our phones, our cameras, everything is very, very high resolution. So, but sometimes we come across cases where we do have to worry about resolution. So let's talk about it. So the first thing I want to talk about with resolution is defining some words. And the first word is pixel. Pixel is the smallest Lego dot, if you will, the smallest little Lego brick, smallest individual piece of a mosaic that makes up your screen or capture device. It's basically like an atom. It's the thing that builds the image that you're looking at. And the resolution is how many of those pixels you have and how close together they are, so their density. So once you know those two pieces of information, you can get pixels per square inch if you're in North America, or pixels per square centimeter if you're in other parts of the world. So these two numbers, we're in a land where we have lots of pixels in not very much space, and they're very close together. So we have high resolution, which gives us really good image quality, gives us lots of detail. So that's kind of nice. But there are cases where you don't have enough resolution. So maybe you downloaded an image from a website or from social media, and those images are all compacted. Some of the file information is thrown out, and the image size is reduced. So if you ever try and take a smaller image, like say from Facebook, and even try and print it at maybe an 8x10, you will not have enough information to print it at that quality. You'll see the big, large blocks of the pixels, and so you'll lose image, and you'll lose detail and image quality. Again, that doesn't happen too often, but the most time it will impact your life is if you ever try and print something. So if you don't have the as close to the original source, a high-resolution source, your printing options and maybe other sharing options will become very, very limited. So always keep your original photos. Don't count on Facebook storing your photos, or Instagram, or even Flickr or something like that. Do save all your original photos, because that will come in handy if you want to have other purposes for them. A little bit about Lightroom coming up here. A couple thoughts on Lightroom, specifically how it's different from Photoshop. We've used Lightroom a lot in class. We use it on all of our photos. So let's take a step back and see why it's so very, very cool. And one of the things that's wonderful about Lightroom is the way it works at its core. It works what's called non-destructively. Non-destructive means it's never going to edit, change the original image. So you're always working on a symbolic file. So it's called a proxy. And what you're seeing on your screen doesn't exist until you export and create a new file. So it's non-destructive. It's good for editing your photos. So that's both sorting your photos and organizing them, as well as then making color and tone changes, as well as any of the adjustment brush and local changes that we've talked about. The organization part of Lightroom is wonderful. Photoshop doesn't do any of that. Photoshop works on one image at a time. It doesn't work non-destructively by default. There's ways to do it, but it's a much more cumbersome app that lets you do some more detail work. But for everyday work, Lightroom is the way to go because of all this. Lightroom is a database, so that means we import images, we export our corrected and changed images, and it's tracking all the changes as you go. So if Lightroom ever crashes, if you just accidentally click on a different photo, you don't have to save. All of your changes are kept as you make them. And then another awesome thing about Lightroom is as you're making changes to any of the controls that we've used so far, you get to see it on screen live. The colors change in real time. The brightnesses change as you brush or use the local adjustment tools. You'll see those effects in real time. Again, Photoshop doesn't work that way all the time. Some of the filters, some of the changes you'll see as you go, but sometimes you have to look at a little screen and click OK and then wait for it. So it slows you down. So that's some of the downsides versus Photoshop, excuse me. So that is basically a summary of how some of the major ways that Lightroom is different than Photoshop and why we use it in this class. Again, you are more functional in Lightroom in just the little bit of time we've spent in it than you would be if we had spent pretty much the whole quarter working on Photoshop so far. And then lastly here, the last topic we'll talk about for your quiz review is reviewing the big three of composition. The three last assignments you've had in class for photo assignments using these big three composition tools. So the first one is filling the frame, using your subject, making sure it fills up the whole image. And the best way to do that is to get closer, especially with phones. Your phones get really, really close to images. And when you get close, it creates interest because it's different than what we normally do. So the way this is accomplished is your main subject fills the majority of your image space. So there's not room for distractions. There's not room for junk and stuff that in the background that would pull your attention away from the subject. So again, this creates interest. If the only thing I have to look at is the subject, I'm going to learn all I can about that. I'm going to be hopefully engaged in that subject and interested, and I want to find out more. And again, the result of all this, doing this, one of the main objectives is less distractions. One of the things that is hard to learn in photography is to pay attention to everything in the screen, things behind your subject, especially maybe in front of. So this is a great practice method to help you not have other stuff which might be distracting, maybe signs in the background or trees or different colors or junk or garbage. All this is a great way to make more interesting photos. Here's some examples coming up of ways to do this. I was just at the Blue Angels at the Museum of Flight, and let's go back here. So this is one of the first photos I took, just a close up. I zoomed in. We were close to the airplanes, but this is with a telephoto lens, zoomed to the maximum, and just showing part of the airplane. And what you're not seeing are all the security people, the cars and trucks on the other side of the road, and the cars on I-5, and all the other stuff in this image. So you just get the Blue Angel sign in the sense of that it's on the airplane here. Here's a close-up of the cockpit. So just a minimalist. Behind the airplane here is I-5 and a train track and other cars and another actually runway for airplanes. So this view of just part of the plane creates interest because we don't normally see this. There's nothing else really to look at. Anything that is behind is blurry, blurry, blurry because of the shallow depth of field with this telephoto lens. So get closer, fill the frame. It doesn't have to completely fill the frame. One of the crewmen here but he probably takes up a little bit more than 50% of the frame. But again, with a telephoto lens, which is easier to do with a camera, you can zoom in and get your background to go blurry, so that helps reduce distractions, and you get to see all the details. You almost can see the stitching. You can see a little bit of his tattoos, the worn, and some of the wear and tear on his ear cover. So fill the frame, get closer, fill up your image space with what you want people to look at. It's a great and simple way to make just about anything more interesting in your photos. Our next composition, big three, is number 2, which is an interesting point of view. Put your camera in a place that is different than where you would normally put your eye. Once you combine all these, it gets even more powerful. So don't just use one. See if you can use 2 or 3 of these big three in your photography. The reason this works is because it puts the camera in a place where you don't normally look at things. So your viewers of your photos will see things differently and maybe not even be able to tell what they are. So their brain is trying to sort it. They're engaged and they just want to look at it for a longer time. So that creates interest in your photo rather than, oh, I know what that is, let me go to the next thing. So interesting point of view, getting low and getting at the eye level of your subject, getting taller, coming from a higher place than your subject, looking down on things. All those things, getting closer, doing angles. If you do something different with your camera where it's located relative to your subject, it is usually much more interesting than if you're just a normal standing height looking at something. And again, this makes almost anything more interesting, but it does help if you've got good light, interesting light, if you've got an interesting subject. But this works with anything, even ordinary objects, but you have to work a lot harder and be even more dramatic and different in the point of view if you don't have a very interesting subject. And then last but not least of the big three of composition is, I've got examples first, sorry. So here's some interesting points of view examples. So I did that again too fast. So this low to the ground, the camera's literally on the ground at the snail eye view here. So the rocks in the foreground become just a blur, and the snail is the only thing you're really looking at. Again, I don't normally look at snails from here. I'm above them looking down, so that creates interest. You're in the view of the snail, so you want to know you're in their story, so it's more interesting. This is just frost on my car window at a tilted, funky angle. So there's nothing fancy going on here. It's just an angle to create shallow depth of field and a little bit of the frost in focus. Again, don't normally put your eye here. You're usually scraping it off rather than looking at it and enjoying the patterns and texture that it creates. Last example photo here is this building in downtown Bellevue. I'm literally standing in the middle of that where those kind of the two halves of the building meet in that fold, if you will, and I'm looking straight up. So I'm leaning far back, just looking straight up with the camera right against almost the side of the building. Not something you normally do. Normally we take photos of buildings from far away, looking at them, and they don't look so tall. So this is a way to create more interest in this photo with an interesting point of view. So our last of our big three of composition is the rule of thirds, the suggestion of thirds, using a grid layout to organize a photo, which helps tell stories, which creates interest in the photo. So rule of thirds is used in most visual arts, in fine art, in painting, in graphic design, in interior design, in multimedia. It's a very, very common way to create layouts. There's something very, very visually pleasing to our brains, and we understand the organization using thirds. So it draws the viewer into the photo by by giving a sense of journey. If if the subject in a photo is in the middle, it's arrived. Whereas if it's on one of the sides, it's going or has come from somewhere. So again, this is interesting because it for our brains it creates structure and form. So that draws interest into us and gets us to look at the photo longer, become more engaged, add ourselves to the photo, which is always a good thing. So that's the overview of rule of thirds. Let's take a look at some examples of the rule of thirds. Let's see, here's number 1 coming up. So this is what the rule of thirds grid looks like. Your frame is divided equally into 3 sections vertically and horizontally. So you've got 9 quadrants to locate your main subject. And there's 4 intersection points which have kind of superpowers of superpowers. So if you can locate your main subject main point on those 4 intersection points, it's even stronger still. Basically, you're avoiding the middle here. You keep your subject, your main point of interest, out of the middle part of the photo. So here's an example of, again, combining an interesting point of view, looking straight up at this building, composing it around the thirds. It's a little rule of thirds-ish, I'll call it. It's so that main line you're looking at is on the right third. Ideally, I would maybe crop it so that the top of the building intersects that top third line as well. But I liked all this sky in here, so I didn't want to lose any sky. Another building, the Smith Tower in Seattle. It's off on the left third. You can see it's kind of centered on the left third there, and creates interest. It's not in the middle. Last example here, this little rabbit at the Bellevue Art Museum, hanging out in the lower right third of my photo. So that's the rule of thirds, the last of the big 3. Fill the frame is number 1. Interesting point of view is number 2. You use those things either, if you can use all 3 of them, man, your photos will be more interesting. Trying to use at least 2 or 3. And then always remember, even when you're using these will help you create interesting photos no matter what you're taking pictures of. I mean, they'll be more interesting. But the end result may not still be guaranteed to be an interesting photo. You still need help from your subject and your light. So don't forget to keep working just because you did rule of thirds or fill the frame or interesting point of view. There's still more work to do to create the whole image as becoming interesting. So that's quiz number 2 review. The topics for your quiz. Again, this quiz will be 10 questions, multiple choice, with 1 bonus fill in the blank question. If you have any questions about the topic, there will also be a PDF of this presentation on Canvas that you can review. If you have any questions about the content, please send me an email. So good luck on the quiz. Happy studying, and we'll see you when I grade your quizzes. Thanks.